I heard my daughter-in-law whisper to my grandson, "She's not your real grandma." And in that moment something inside me didn't break, it went completely still. I was standing in the doorway between the kitchen and the living room, holding a dish towel I had folded 3 times already, listening to the soft hum of the television and the quiet rhythm of my own breathing. Ethan was sitting cross-legged on the rug, his small hands wrapped around a toy car, looking up at her with that trusting expression children have when they believe every word an adult says is the truth. Jessica didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She leaned down just enough so only he could hear, but I was close enough. I always was. Close enough to hear the things I wasn't meant to hear. "What does that mean?" Ethan asked, his voice small, confused. Jessica smiled in that gentle, practiced way she used in front of other people, brushing a piece of hair from his forehead. "It just means not everyone in a family is really family," she said softly, like she was explaining something simple, something harmless. I didn't move. I didn't step forward. I didn't say her name. I just stood there, my fingers tightening around the cloth until the fabric twisted between them. Because the truth was I had been expecting something like this. Not those exact words, not spoken so quietly, but the feeling, the slow shift in the air over the past year, the subtle distance that had grown between me and my grandson, the way Jessica always seemed to step in at the exact moment Ethan ran toward me, redirecting him with a question or a distraction or a reminder about something else. I had noticed it. Of course I had. Women like me notice everything. We just don't always speak on it right away. "Go wash your hands," she added, standing up and smoothing her sweater like nothing had happened. Ethan nodded and ran past me toward the hallway without looking up. He didn't reach for me this time. He didn't stop. I watched him go, the sound of his footsteps fading, and only then did Jessica turn her head and see me standing there. For a second, just a second, something flickered across her face. Not guilt. Not surprise. Something sharper. Something calculating. "Margaret," she said, her voice light, as if we were about to talk about dinner or the weather. "I didn't see you there." I nodded once. "I can tell," I said quietly. She held my gaze, searching for something. Anger, maybe, or confusion, but I gave her neither. I had learned a long time ago that the most powerful thing you can give someone like Jessica is silence. Not the weak kind. The kind that watches. The kind that waits. "Ethan misunderstood," she added after a moment, crossing her arms loosely. "Kids hear things and twist them. You know how they are." I folded the dish towel one last time, slow and precise, placing it on the counter beside me. "Children usually understand more than we think," I replied. My voice didn't shake. That surprised even me. She smiled again, but it didn't reach her eyes. "You're reading too much into it." Maybe I was. Maybe I wasn't. But as I stood there looking at her, I felt something settle deep in my chest. Not anger. Not yet. Something colder. Because this wasn't the first time something hadn't added up. It wasn't the first time I had looked at Ethan and noticed how little of Daniel I could see in him. Not the eyes. Not the smile. Not even the way he laughed. I had told myself it didn't matter. Love doesn't measure things like that. Family isn't built on details that small. But now, standing in that quiet room with Jessica watching me so carefully, I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to think before. What if this wasn't just about pushing me away? What if it was about something much bigger? I gave her a small, polite nod, the kind you give a stranger at the grocery store. "Dinner's in 20 minutes, I said, and turned back toward the kitchen before she could respond. Behind me I could feel her eyes on my back. Measuring. Calculating. Waiting to see what I would do next. But I already knew one thing for certain. I wasn't going to argue with her. I wasn't going to ask questions she could lie about. And I definitely wasn't going to let her think she had already won. Because if I wasn't Ethan's real grandmother, then someone in this house had been lying for a very long time. And I intended to find out exactly who. I barely slept that night, not because of what was said, but because of how easily it was said, as if it had been practiced, as if it had been waiting for the right moment to slip out into the open. The house felt different after that. Quieter in a way that was not peaceful, more like everything was holding its breath. I sat at the kitchen table long after everyone had gone to bed, the clock on the wall ticking louder than usual, counting seconds I could not seem to move past. I kept replaying the scene in my mind, not the words themselves but Ethan's face, The way his eyes searched hers for meaning, the way he accepted her answer without question. Children always do. They trust first and ask questions later. And that trust, once shaped, becomes something much harder to undo. The next morning I woke up before sunrise, something I had not done in years. The sky outside my window was still gray. The kind of early light that makes everything look unfinished. I made coffee the same way I always did, 2 scoops, a splash of milk, nothing complicated, but even that routine felt slightly off, like I was performing a habit instead of living it. When Daniel came downstairs, he looked surprised to see me already sitting there. "You are up early," he said, rubbing the back of his neck as he reached for a mug. I watched him for a moment before answering. He had his father's posture, the same slight lean forward, the same quiet presence that used to make a room feel steady. "Could not sleep," I said simply. He nodded, not asking anything more. That was how it had been lately. Fewer questions. Shorter conversations. Less of the easy back and forth we used to have. Jessica came down a few minutes later, her hair neatly tied back, already dressed as if she had planned the morning down to the minute. She greeted me with a polite smile, the same one she used with neighbors and cashiers, and poured herself a cup of coffee without saying anything about the night before. Not a word. Not even a glance that acknowledged it had happened. That told me more than any explanation ever could. People who make mistakes tend to explain them. People who do things on purpose tend to move forward as if nothing needs to be explained. Ethan came running down the stairs a little later, his energy filling the room in a way that made everything else fade for a moment. "Grandma, look," he said, holding up a drawing, bright colors spread unevenly across the page. I smiled and reached for it, my fingers brushing his as I took it from him. "This is beautiful," I said, and I meant it. He grinned, but only for a second before his eyes flicked toward Jessica. Just a quick check, almost automatic, like he was making sure it was all right to stand there with me. I felt that more than anything else. Not what was said, but what had already changed. "Go finish your breakfast," Jessica said gently, placing a bowl in front of him. He nodded and sat down, the moment gone as quickly as it had appeared. I set the drawing carefully on the table and took a slow sip of my coffee, letting the warmth settle in my chest. It was not just about one sentence. It was about everything that had led to it. The small interruptions, the redirected conversations, the subtle distance that had grown piece by piece until it felt normal. But now it did not feel normal anymore. Now it felt deliberate. After they left for the day, I walked through the house slowly, noticing things I had overlooked before. The framed photos in the hallway, the ones Jessica had chosen, most of them taken after she came into the picture. There were fewer of the older ones now, fewer reminders of what the family looked like before her. I stopped in front of one photo in particular, Ethan at 3 years old standing between Daniel and Jessica, all of them smiling. I studied his face longer than I ever had, tracing the lines, the shape of his eyes, the way his smile curved just slightly to one side. Something about it felt unfamiliar, not wrong, just not connected in the way I had always assumed. I stepped back and let my hands rest at my sides, the quiet of the house pressing in around me. Maybe I had ignored things because it was easier. Maybe I had chosen not to see what did not fit. But I was not going to do that anymore. Because whatever Jessica had meant by those words, whatever truth she was trying to hide or reshape, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. People do not plant ideas like that in a child's mind unless they are protecting something. And whatever she was protecting, I was going to find it. I did not go to the bank that day, and I did not call anyone either, because the truth has a way of revealing itself when you stop chasing it and start paying attention instead. That afternoon, I drove to the park 2 miles from the house, the one with the old oak trees and the faded blue benches where families gather after school. It was not a coincidence. Jessica brought Ethan there every Wednesday. She had mentioned it once casually as if it did not matter, but I remembered. I parked across the street and sat in my car for a while, watching the slow rhythm of the place, children running, parents talking, dogs pulling on their leashes. Nothing unusual. Nothing that would make a person think something was wrong. And yet I felt it again, that quiet shift in the air, the same one I had felt in my own home. After a few minutes I saw them. Ethan ran ahead first, his backpack bouncing against his shoulders, heading straight for the swings. Jessica followed behind, her phone already in her hand, her attention divided the way it often was. She looked like any other mother in that moment. Calm, collected, in control. I stepped out of the car but did not walk toward them right away. Instead, I stayed near the edge of the parking lot just watching. That was when I noticed him. He was sitting on a bench about 20 feet from the playground, not close enough to draw attention, but not far enough to be random either. A man in his late 30s, maybe early 40s, dressed simply, jeans and a dark jacket, his posture still but not relaxed. He was watching Ethan. Not in a casual way, not like someone who happened to notice a child playing, but in a focused, quiet way that felt intentional. I told myself I was imagining things, that I was letting one sentence from the night before turn into something larger than it was. But then Ethan laughed, a bright, clear sound that carried across the park, and the man's expression changed. It softened, just for a second, and there was something in that look that made my chest tighten. Recognition. Not curiosity. Not interest. Recognition. I walked slowly toward the playground, keeping my pace steady, my eyes moving between Ethan and the man. Jessica had not noticed him. She was still scrolling through her phone, occasionally glancing up to check on Ethan, but not really seeing anything beyond him. I sat on a bench a few feet away, close enough that Ethan would spot me if he turned around, but far enough that I did not interrupt whatever pattern I was trying to understand. The man did not move. He did not approach. He just sat there, his hands resting on his knees, his gaze steady. After a few minutes, Ethan ran toward Jessica, asking for something I could not hear, and she stood up, brushing off her jeans. 5 more minutes, she said, her voice light, already turning back toward her phone. Ethan nodded and ran off again, passing directly in front of the man this time. As he did, the man's eyes followed him closely, every step, every movement, as if he was memorizing something he was afraid to lose. I felt it then, not as a thought, but as a certainty settling into place. This was not random. This was not coincidence. And whatever Jessica had meant by those words the night before, whatever she had been trying to plant in Ethan's mind, it was connected to this. I stood up slowly, my heart steady despite the weight building in my chest, and took a few steps toward the bench where the man sat. He noticed me before I said anything, his body tensing just slightly, like someone who had been expecting this moment, but was not sure how it would unfold. For a second, neither of us spoke. The sounds of the park continued around us, children laughing, a dog barking in the distance, the ordinary world moving forward as if nothing had changed. But everything had. Because as I looked at him, really looked at him, I saw something I could not ignore anymore. Not just the way he watched Ethan. Not just the way his expression softened when the boy smiled. I saw the resemblance. Subtle but there. In the eyes. In the shape of his jaw. In the way he held himself without realizing it. And suddenly, the question that had been forming in the back of my mind since the night before was no longer a question at all. It was the beginning of an answer I was not sure any of us were ready to face. I stopped a few feet away from him, close enough that he could not pretend he had not been seen, but not so close that I made a scene. He looked up at me slowly, and for a moment, I saw something pass through his expression that felt almost like relief. Not fear. Not irritation. Relief. That alone told me more than anything he could have said. You have been watching him, I said quietly, my voice steady, not accusing, just stating what was already obvious. He hesitated, his eyes shifting briefly toward Ethan, who was now climbing up the ladder to the slide, laughing as another child followed behind him. I have, he admitted after a moment, his voice low, careful, as if every word mattered. I nodded once, letting the silence stretch just long enough to see if he would add anything on his own. He did not. That meant I would have to ask. Why? I said. He exhaled slowly, his shoulders rising and falling in a way that suggested he had been holding something in for a long time. Because I think he is my son, he said. The words did not hit me the way I thought they would. There was no sharp shock, no sudden wave of disbelief. Instead, it felt like something settling into place, something I had already begun to understand before he said it out loud. I looked back at Ethan, at the way he moved, the way he laughed, and then back at the man in front of me. And you are certain of that? I asked. He shook his head slightly. I am certain enough to not walk away, he replied. That answer stayed with me longer than anything else. Not certain enough to claim. Not certain enough to demand, but certain enough to stay. That was not the behavior of someone guessing. That was the behavior of someone who had already seen too much to ignore. "What is your name?" I asked. "David," he said. "David Carter." I repeated it quietly, committing it to memory the same way I used to remember details when my husband was still alive, when paying attention to the smallest things could change everything. "How long have you been coming here?" I asked. "A few months," he said. "Not every week. Just enough to see him. To make sure." He stopped himself before finishing the sentence. I did not need him to make sure he was real, to make sure he was safe, to make sure he was still within reach, even if he did not know it yet. I folded my hands together in front of me, feeling the calm settle deeper into my chest. This was no longer about a single sentence spoken in a living room. This was something that had been building long before I noticed it. "Jessica," I said, watching his reaction carefully. He looked away for a brief second, just enough to confirm what I needed to know. "You know her," I continued. "I used to," he said quietly. "Used to. Not know. Not met. Used to." That word carried weight. History. Something that had not been resolved. "And she knows you are here?" I asked. He shook his head immediately. "No. If she did, she would not bring him here anymore." That made sense. Everything about Jessica was controlled, planned, measured. If there was something she did not want seen, she would remove it completely. Just like she had been trying to remove me. I glanced back toward her. She was still standing near the edge of the playground, her phone in her hand, her attention drifting in and out of whatever was happening around her. She had no idea what was unfolding just a few steps away. "You should be careful," I said to him. "She does not like things she cannot control." He gave a small, almost humorless smile. "I have already learned that," he said. I believed him. I stood there for another moment, letting the pieces settle, letting the shape of the truth begin to form. Then I turned back toward him one last time. "If what you are saying is true," I said, my voice calm but firm, "then this is not just your situation. It is mine too." He looked at me, then really looked at me, as if he was seeing something he had not expected. "I know," he said. "That is why I did not stop coming." I nodded once more, then stepped away, walking back toward the path that led out of the park. I did not look back again. I did not need to, because now I understood something I had not understood before. Jessica had not just been pushing me away. She had been protecting a story. And the moment that story started to crack, everything she had built around it would start to fall apart. The only question left was how far she was willing to go to keep it from happening. That evening I returned home with a kind of calm I had not felt in a long time. The kind that comes not from peace, but from clarity. The house was quiet when I walked in. The soft hum of the refrigerator the only sound greeting me as I set my keys down on the counter. I moved through the kitchen slowly, touching familiar surfaces as if confirming they were still mine, still real, still unchanged despite everything that had shifted beneath them. Because that was the strange part. Nothing looked different. The chairs were in the same place. The clock still ticked. The photographs still lined the walls. But now I could see what had been hidden between all of it. I poured myself a glass of water and stood by the sink, staring out into the backyard where the grass had started to turn a lighter shade of green with the season. I thought about Jessica. The way she spoke. The way she smiled. The way she controlled a room without ever raising her voice. And now I understood something I had not fully grasped before. She had never been reacting to the family. She had been managing it. Every conversation, every interaction, every detail, carefully placed, carefully adjusted, until everything looked natural, until no one questioned it, until the truth could sit right in front of us and still go unnoticed. I set the glass down and walked into the hallway, stopping in front of the same photograph I had studied earlier. Ethan at 3. Daniel beside him. Jessica on the other side. I looked at Daniel's face this time, really looked at it, and then back at Ethan's. The difference was no longer subtle. It was clear. And the only reason I had not seen it before was because I had not been looking for it. I let out a slow breath, my fingers brushing lightly against the frame. "How long have you known?" I murmured quietly, not expecting an answer, but asking the question anyway. Not to the photograph. Not to the house. But to her. Because now that I had seen the truth, I knew there was only one possibility. Jessica had known from the beginning. And if she had known, then everything else she had done made sense. The distance. The control. The quiet removal of anyone who might ask questions she could not afford to answer. I turned away and walked back into the kitchen, my steps more certain now, my thoughts moving faster. This was not just about Ethan. This was about Daniel. My son who had trusted completely, who had built his life around a story that was never true. And I realized then that I could not wait. I could not sit back and observe any longer. Because the longer this continued, the deeper it would go. The harder it would be to undo. I reached for my phone, hesitating for just a second before unlocking it. My reflection stared back at me in the black screen before it lit up. Older than I remembered. Sharper than I had been in years. I scrolled through my contacts until I found his name and pressed call. It rang twice before he answered. Mom! Daniel's voice came through, distracted at first, like he was already in the middle of something else. Is everything okay? I closed my eyes briefly, choosing my words carefully. Not everything. Not yet. I need to talk to you, I said, my voice calm but firm. Not here. Not with Jessica around. Just you and me. There was a pause on the other end, longer this time. I could almost hear him shifting, processing the tone more than the words. That sounds serious, he said. It is, I replied. Another pause. Then, okay. Tomorrow morning. I will meet you. I ended the call without saying anything more and set the phone down on the counter. The house felt different now. Not quiet. Not empty. But waiting. Because this was the moment everything would begin to change. And for the first time since that sentence was spoken in my living room, I was no longer reacting. I was moving forward. And I knew something else with absolute certainty. Jessica had spent years building a version of this family that only worked as long as no one questioned it. But the moment someone did, the moment even one piece of it was pulled loose, the entire structure would start to collapse. And I was about to pull the first piece. I arrived 10 minutes early the next morning, choosing a small diner just off Main Street where Daniel and I used to come years ago when life felt simpler and conversations did not require careful planning. The place had not changed much. The same cracked leather booths, the same smell of coffee and butter, the same quiet hum of early customers starting their day. I sat near the window, my hands wrapped around a mug that had already gone warm, watching the door each time it opened. When Daniel finally walked in, he looked tired. Not just from work, but from something deeper, something that had been building long before I called him. He spotted me quickly and walked over, offering a small smile that did not quite reach his eyes. "You look serious," he said as he slid into the seat across from me. I did not waste time. There was no gentle way to begin this. "I need you to listen to me," I said, my voice calm but steady. He leaned back slightly, his brow tightening. "Okay," he replied. I held his gaze for a moment, making sure I had his full attention before I spoke again. "What I am about to say is going to be difficult," I continued. "And you are not going to like it. But I need you to hear all of it before you decide what to do." He nodded slowly, the seriousness of my tone settling in. I took a breath. "I went to the park yesterday," I said. "The one Jessica takes Ethan to." His expression shifted slightly, confusion mixing with concern. "Why?" he asked. "Because I needed to see something for myself," I replied. I watched him carefully as I spoke, measuring every reaction, every change in his posture. And while I was there, I met someone. That caught his attention. He leaned forward now, his hands resting on the table. "Who?" I did not answer right away. Instead, I reached into my bag and pulled out a folded piece of paper. I had written a name on the night before. I placed it between us. "David Carter," I said quietly. Daniel glanced down at the name, then back up at me. "I do not know anyone by that name," he said. I nodded. "No," I replied. "But Jessica does." The silence that followed was heavy, stretching just long enough for the words to begin settling into something more than a simple statement. "What are you saying?" he asked, his voice lower now. I kept my tone even. "I am saying that this man has been coming to that park for months," I said. "Watching Ethan. Not casually. Not by accident. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly. That sounds like something we should report, he said quickly, his instinct immediate protective. I thought the same thing at first, I said. Until I spoke to him. That made him pause. You spoke to him? I nodded once. Yes, I said. And he told me something that you need to hear. Daniel leaned back again, his eyes narrowing as if he was trying to understand where this was going before I said it out loud. He believes Ethan is his son, I said. The words sat between us, quiet but impossible to ignore. Daniel did not react right away. He just stared at me, as if waiting for me to take it back, to correct myself, to explain that this was all some kind of misunderstanding. When I did not, his expression hardened. That is not possible, he said firmly. I did not argue. I did not push. I simply held his gaze and let the silence do the work, because this was the moment where denial begins, and I knew better than to fight it head on. I understand why you would say that, I replied calmly. I would have said the same thing yesterday. He shook his head slightly, running a hand through his hair. Mom, you are talking about my son, he said, his voice tightening. I know exactly who my son is. I nodded again slowly. Do you? I asked, not as a challenge, but as a question he had not allowed himself to consider. That was when something shifted. Just slightly. Not enough to change his mind. Not yet. But enough to create a crack. And once a crack appears, it does not take much for it to spread. I did not push him after that question because I could see it in his face, the exact moment where certainty started to slip just enough to make room for doubt. Daniel looked down at the table, his fingers tapping lightly against the surface, a habit he had picked up years ago whenever he was trying to process something he did not want to accept. This is not possible, he repeated, but this time it sounded less like a statement and more like something he needed to convince himself of. I let a few seconds pass before speaking again. I am not asking you to believe him, I said quietly. I am asking you to look at everything you have not questioned. He glanced up at me then, his eyes sharper now, searching. What is that supposed to mean? I reached for my coffee, taking a slow sip, giving him just enough space to lean into the question instead of pushing away from it. It means timelines, I said. It means details. It means things that did not matter before but might matter now. He frowned, his mind already starting to move, even if he did not want it to. Jessica told you Ethan was premature, I continued, keeping my voice steady. 3 weeks early. He nodded automatically. Yes, he said. That is what happened. I tilted my head slightly. And you never questioned it? I asked. He hesitated just for a second. Why would I? He replied. The doctor confirmed everything. He was healthy. I am not questioning his health, I said gently. I am asking if you ever thought about the timing. That was when the silence changed. It was no longer defensive. It was thinking. I watched as he leaned back again, his eyes shifting away from me, not because he was avoiding the conversation, but because he was replaying something in his own mind. We got married in June, he said slowly. Ethan was born in January. He stopped there, the math hanging unfinished between us. I did not fill it in for him. I did not need to. He could do that on his own. His jaw tightened slightly as he continued, almost to himself now. That would make it. He did not finish the sentence, but I saw it in his expression. The calculation. The realization that something did not align as perfectly as he had always believed. Jessica said the dates were off because of complications, he added quickly, trying to recover the narrative he had been given. She said the doctors were not sure at first. I nodded. She has an answer for everything, I said softly. That is what makes it work. He looked at me again, this time with something closer to unease than frustration. You are making a lot of assumptions based on one conversation with a stranger, he said, but the conviction in his voice was weaker now. I agree, I replied calmly, which is why I did not stop there. That caught his attention immediately. What do you mean? He asked. I reached into my bag again, pulling out a small envelope I had picked up that morning, placing it on the table between us but not pushing it toward him yet. I asked him how long he had known Jessica, I said, and he told me enough to understand that this is not something that started yesterday. Daniel's eyes moved from my face to the envelope, then back again. "What is that?" he asked. I did not answer right away. Instead, I let my fingers rest lightly on top of it, feeling the weight of what it represented. "It is not proof," I said. "Not yet. But it is enough to ask the right questions." He stared at it for a moment longer, then leaned forward slightly, his voice quieter now. "What kind of questions?" I met his gaze directly, not letting him look away this time. "The kind that she cannot answer twice," I said. And for the first time since the conversation began, Daniel did not argue. He did not deny. He just sat there, looking at the envelope as if it might contain the version of his life he had not been prepared to see. And in that moment I knew the truth had already started doing its work. Because once a person begins to question something they have always believed, there is no easy way to go back to not knowing. Daniel did not open the envelope right away, and that told me everything I needed to know about where his mind was. It was no longer a question of whether something was wrong. It was a question of how much he was ready to see. He sat there for a long moment, his hand hovering just above the table, as if touching it would make everything real in a way he could not undo. "If I open that," he said quietly, "there is no going back, is there?" I shook my head slowly. "No," I replied. "There is not." He let out a slow breath, leaning back again, his eyes drifting toward the window where morning light had started to brighten the street outside. For a few seconds he said nothing. Then, almost as if speaking to himself, he said, "I keep thinking about the way she said things. Little things. Details that never quite lined up, but I did not question them because—" He stopped, his voice trailing off. "Because you trusted her," I finished gently. He nodded once. "Yes," he said. "I trusted her." I watched him carefully, not pushing, not rushing, just letting the realization build at its own pace. Because this was not something that could be forced. It had to unfold. "You said he has been watching Ethan for months," Daniel said after a moment. "Why would he wait that long if he really believed what he told you?" It was a fair question. A logical one. And I had asked it myself the night before. "Because he was not sure how to approach it," I said. "Because he did not want to destroy something if he was wrong. And because people like Jessica make it very difficult to get close without being noticed." Daniel's jaw tightened slightly at that. "You really believe all of this," he said. I met his gaze without hesitation. "I believe enough to not ignore it," I replied. That was when he finally reached forward and picked up the envelope. His fingers were steady, but I could see the tension in the way he held it, the careful control of someone trying to keep everything contained. He turned it over once, as if expecting it to reveal something on its own, then slowly slid his finger under the flap. I did not speak. I did not interrupt. I simply watched as he unfolded the paper inside and read the first few lines. His eyes moved quickly at first, then slower, then stopped completely. The change in his expression was subtle, but unmistakable. It was not shock. Not exactly. It was recognition. The kind that comes when something you have been avoiding finally steps into the open. "This is a timeline," he said, his voice low. "Dates. Locations." I nodded. "It matches what he told me," I said. "And more importantly, it overlaps with when you met Jessica." Daniel swallowed, his grip tightening slightly on the paper. "She told me she had just moved here," he said. "She said she did not know anyone. That she was starting over." I tilted my head slightly. "That may be true," I said. "Just not in the way you thought." He looked up at me then, and for the first time there was no resistance in his eyes. Only the beginning of understanding. "If this is real," he said slowly, "then everything I thought I knew about my life—" He did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. We both knew how it ended. I leaned forward slightly, my voice calm but firm. "This is not about tearing your life apart," I said. "It is about seeing it clearly. And once you do, you get to decide what happens next." He looked back down at the paper, his mind moving faster now, connecting pieces that had never been meant to fit together. "I need to talk to her," he said finally. I shook my head once, not sharply, but enough to make him pause. "Not yet," I said. "Not without knowing exactly what you are asking." He frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" I held his gaze steady and unyielding. I mean, you only get one chance to ask the question that matters, I said. And if you ask it the wrong way, she will give you an answer that sounds right but changes nothing. He sat back again, the weight of that settling in, as he knew I was right. Jessica did not react. She redirected. She did not deny. She adjusted. And if he went to her now, unprepared, she would simply rebuild the story in a way that kept everything intact. I watched him carefully as he folded the paper back into the envelope, slower this time, more deliberate. When he set it down, his hands did not shake anymore. Then we do this the right way, he said quietly. And that was the moment I knew something had shifted completely, because he was no longer defending her. He was preparing to question her. And once that line is crossed, there is no way back to what existed before. We did not speak much after that. Not because there was nothing left to say, but because everything that mattered had already been set in motion. Daniel paid the bill without looking at it, his movements precise, controlled, as if focusing on small tasks was the only way to keep everything else from unraveling too quickly. When we stepped outside, the air felt different, sharper somehow, like the world had shifted just enough to remind us that nothing we were about to do could be undone. I will talk to her tonight, he said. His voice steady now, not rushed, not emotional, just certain. I nodded once. Do not accuse, I replied. Ask. He looked at me, understanding what I meant without needing more explanation. Because accusations give people room to defend. Questions force them to reveal. That evening, I did not go to their house. I stayed in my own, sitting in the same chair near the window, watching the light fade slowly into darkness. I did not turn on the television. I did not distract myself. I simply waited. Time moved differently in moments like that. Slower. Heavier. Every minute stretching just enough to make you aware of it. When my phone finally rang, I did not answer right away. I let it ring once more just to steady my breath, before picking it up. Mom! Daniel's voice came through, quieter than I had ever heard it. Not broken. Not angry. Just different. I asked her, he said. I closed my eyes briefly. And there was a pause. I could hear something in the background, movement, maybe footsteps, a door closing. Then silence again. She did not deny it, he said. The words landed without impact, not because they were small, but because they were expected. What did she say? I asked. Another pause. Longer this time. She said it did not matter, he replied. My hand tightened slightly around the phone. She said I raised him. That I am his father in every way that counts. I let that sit for a moment before speaking again. And what did you say? He exhaled slowly, the sound carrying more weight than any words. I asked her why she lied, he said. And she told me the truth. Would have complicated things. Complicated things. I almost smiled at that. Not out of amusement but out of recognition. Because that was exactly how she saw it. Not as a betrayal. Not as something that would break a family. Just inconvenient. And then I asked. And then I asked her something else, he continued, his voice steadier now. I asked her why she told Ethan that you were not his real grandmother. This time the silence on the line felt different. Not heavy. Not uncertain. Clear. What did she say? I asked quietly. She said she did not want him getting attached to someone who was not really connected to him, Daniel replied. I opened my eyes, staring out into the darkened yard, the faint outline of the fence barely visible. And what did you say? I asked again. His answer came without hesitation. I told her that if she was going to talk about what is real, he said, then we needed to start with the truth she has been hiding. I felt something settle in my chest then. Not relief. Not satisfaction. Something closer to balance. Because this was no longer hidden. It was no longer controlled. It was no longer something she could shape quietly from the edges. Where is she now? I asked. Upstairs, he said. Packing a bag. I did not react right away. I let the image form on its own. Jessica moving through the room, selecting what she would take, what she would leave behind, deciding what parts of her life she could carry forward into whatever came next. And Ethan? I asked. He is asleep, Daniel replied softly. He does not know anything yet. I nodded to myself even though he could not see it. We will figure out how to tell him, I said. Together. There was a small pause then. Yes, he said. Together. We stayed on the line for a few seconds longer, neither of us speaking, neither of us needing to. Because the hardest part was not what had been revealed. It was what came after. The choices. The rebuilding. The quiet work of putting something back together without pretending it was ever the same. Before I hung up, I said one last thing. You are still his father, I told him. No matter what anyone says. Daniel did not answer right away. But when he did, his voice was steady in a way I had not heard in years. I know, he said. And this time I believed him.